What's up guys, CT Kidney here, and today we're going to be taking a look at Shadow Priest and WoW TBC Classic. I just want to start off by saying that thematically this is probably my favorite spec ever, and I've been playing it ever since actual TBC was out, so I got a pretty good idea of what I know. The problem, however, is that unfortunately the spec is about to fall off the planet in terms of DPS. It'll still be an incredibly valuable support class going forward, but if you're looking to top meters, it's just not what the class is going to be doing. I'm making this video to disclose to everyone who cares about this spec as much as I do to what could be done to make it a competitive DPS. I totally understand that nothing is going to happen, as TBC is pretty much a set in stone game in terms of class design. There are not going to be any class changes whatsoever due to this being a remake of the old TBC, but I thought it could be fun anyways to do some armchair class design and figure out how we could make the Shadow Priest a competitive DPS class. A couple caveats I want to mention. I'm going to do my best to not just copy paste changes made from Wrath of the Lich King, as I feel I want to capture the essence of the TBC Shadow Priest, and also I wanted to avoid doing anything totally arbitrary, like just increasing the damage of the spells up to a percentage amount so that they would be competitive, as I feel that would kind of be a cop-out. So without further ado, let's get into it. So as with anything you're trying to improve, you have to figure out what the weaknesses are and how you can patch them up. So I've taken a look at several aspects of what makes an actual DPS class good, and seen how Shadow compares to them. So let's start with the bread and butter of any spec, and that's going to be the talent tree. The Shadow Priest talent tree is by no means bad, but it's just not as good as other casters. First, our filler spell needs to be spec'd into. No other class in the whole game has to do this. In fact, most of the issues Shadow has stem from this one spell, but I'll get into that more later. Improved Fade is useless. There's never a time when you need to hit Fade 6 seconds sooner than you already would, and if you need to fade this much on CD, there's a bigger problem in your raid. Shadow Power gives us 15% crit on Shadow Word Death and Mind Blast. This might seem like it's good on paper, but when you consider that these are the only two spells we have that can actually crit, and that we have no crit bonuses, it doesn't make it very good to just have an arbitrary chance to crit on two spells that have a big cooldown anyway. Most of the talents we do take increase our damage by just a flat percentage. This is a problem I'll go into more later, as on paper it might seem like this is really good, but when we get into the actual spells and how they work, it's kind of a problem. But these talents includes things like Shadow Weaving, Shadow Form, and Darkness. The sixth issue is after you finish the Shadow Tree, there's nowhere you can go in the other two trees to meaningfully impact your damage. The only thing you can do is take meditation for more mana regen in combat, but remember that mana regen works off of spirit, which we don't stack too much of. You also get inner focus, which gives you a free spell every 3 minutes, which is only good if you're undead and you can macro it to Devouring Plague. Otherwise, it's kind of useless. Now that we've talked about some of the issues with some of the talents we take as Shadow, let's take a look at the comparison between other specs. So Arcane and Fire Mages can go into Frost and get Icy Veins pretty early on, which is a very good casting speed buff. Warlocks can go into Demonology and pick up Demonic Sacrifice for just a flat 15% damage increase. Elemental Shamans even get a 5% crit chance in Restoration. Shadow gets no crit multiplier and no crit synergy, and we have nothing to compensate for this huge loss in damage. Fire Mage gets Ignite for synergy, Arcane Mage gets 50% crit damage, Frost Mage gets 100%, Warlocks get 100%, Elemental Shamans get 100%, and so on and so forth. Hell, even Smite Priest has Surge of Light for a 50% chance to get a free smite after they crit. The only thing we get in terms to compensate for this is about 2 to 3% more damage increases than your average caster, which, as I said before, is not that big of a deal, and I'll go over why later. We also aren't given a burst cooldown to increase our damage. Shadow Fiend, you might want to point out, is something that we do have, but it's only ever used to get mana back, and it's never really used as a DPS cooldown unless you know the fight is going to end before your mana runs out. And even then, it does very minuscule damage even when paired with Heroism. And I say again, every mage can get Icy Veins, Elemental Shamans get Elemental Mastery, Druids get Force of Nature, all of these other casters get something good in their talent trees or even baseline to increase their burst DPS, whereas we just don't really have anything like that. Now that we're done with the talents, we're going to take a look at the actual spells, and this is where what I mentioned before about Mind Flay being the bulk of the issue is going to come into play. So let's take a look at our spell's actual damage, just to explain quickly to those of you who do not know, or those of you who may not play casters. A spell's coefficient is the amount of damage it gains from spell power. So for example, Fireball from a mage has 100% coefficient, which means it gets 100% of the benefit from spell power. If you have 1,000 spell power, Fireball does 1,000 more damage. Pretty simple. Typically, coefficients are balanced off of the cast time of the spell. A longer cast time has a high coefficient, and a shorter cast time has a lower one. So can someone tell me why Mind Flay, a 3-second channel time, has a 57% coefficient? Like what is this? So to compare it, I'm putting it up against Starfire and Fireball, which both have a 3-second cast time, which can be shortened with talents without affecting their coefficients, by the way. And they have 100% coefficients. The only difference being that Mind Flay is a channel spell, and these are cast spells, which makes no difference in how the damage actually happens. But also, in addition to these spells having 100% coefficient, despite being the same cast or channel time as Mind Flay, they can also critically strike, which Mind Flay can't, so they can do even more damage. To put things into perspective, the Druid spell Wrath, which is a 1.5 second cooldown, has the same coefficient roughly as Mind Flay, meaning that you can fit 2 Wraths into a Mind Flay, but only 1 Wrath does the same or more damage if it critically strikes. And this is just Mind Flay. Like, Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death have the same coefficient of 43% for some reason, despite one being an instant cast and one being a cast time, but they both also have cooldowns. So you have to use stanky ass Mind Flay as your filler spell while you wait. To be fair, Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain both have 100 and 110% coefficients respectively, but dots don't scale with haste yet, which brings me to my next point, being gear. Gearing as a Shadow Priest just kind of feels really bad. Like, even when you get a crazy good item, it's legit just better on someone else. The main reason for this is because, as I've said several times now, only 2 of our spells can actually critically strike, and they both have cooldowns. And they receive no additional multiplier or synergy from talents if they do crit. In fact, Shadow Word Death actually hurts us more, which essentially makes crit almost useless to us, and haste isn't even much better. As I mentioned, dots don't scale with haste yet, so all this does is mean we get to cast more trash-ass Mind Flays. But because Mind Flay can't crit, it's not as good, because increasing the cast speed with haste means more crits for every other DPS class in the game, but for us it just means 1 or 2 more ticks of Mind Flay. So that leaves us with Spell Power. Spell Power is our best stat by far, but because of our incredibly low coefficients, Spell Power, we don't get a lot of benefit from it. Like I said, with Mind Flay, we only get 57% of the actual Spell Power as a benefit, and this is why all the percentage damage increases we have are just not really that good, because it's a percentage damage increase of a Spell Power ratio that is horrible to begin with. And that pretty much sums up all the issues we have as Shadow Priests scaling into the game or trying to do really good damage, but how do we fix them? So I've come up with a couple of things that I think would really help, and again, I know none of these changes are going to happen, as TBC is a set in stone game pretty much, but it's still fun to theorize. The first change I would make to the talents is to just give Mind Flay baseline. Like, I don't understand why we need to spec into our filler spell when no other class in the game needs to do this, and on top of that, as I've gone over, it's a horrible spell. This leaves room in the talent tree for something I like to call Improved Mind Flay. Improved Mind Flay is going to increase the benefit that Mind Flay receives from spell power equal to your critical strike chance. So for example, at the end of phase 2, Shadow Priests roughly have 18 to 20% critical strike chance. So this would mean that the spell power coefficient of Mind Flay wouldn't be 57%, it would be 77%. This solves two major issues of the spec, one being the horrible coefficient that Mind Flay has, while simultaneously making Critical Strike a good stat for us, but it doesn't completely shift our stat priority over to crit. The next change was something I didn't mention earlier, but it is to add Vampiric Touch to the improved Shadow Word Pain talent. This would just increase the duration of Vampiric Touch by 6 seconds. It's just a nice quality of life thing, which means we'd get to cast more Mind Flays instead of refreshing our dots. The third change I would make is just to slap Mind Flay onto the Shadow Power talent, but reduce it from 15% crit to 10%. With the above change to improved Mind Flay that I made, this will increase the coefficient by 10%, and the reason I brought it down from 15% is because I think that 15% base ratio, you know, just as an increase to Mind Flay would be too much, so I just lowered it down to 10%. Removing improved Fade. As I mentioned earlier, this talent is completely useless. I've never seen anyone take this or have a reason to take this, it's just bad. Instead, I'm going to replace it with something called Mind Melt. What Mind Melt would do is when your dots tick, you have a 5 to 10% chance, depending on rank, to increase the cast time of your next Mind Flay by 100%. I feel this is a nice change because it gives the dots some synergy while also changing up the user rotation very slightly. Now this doesn't mean Mind Flay would be instant cast, it would just increase the channel time by 100%, so instead of a 3-second cast, it would be a 1.5-second cast. The last change I would make would not even be to the Shadow Tree, it would just be making it so that Power Infusion is where Divine Spirit is in the Discipline Tree, so that we could actually go and get a meaningful DPS increase, like a burst cooldown, from the other tree after we finish Shadow. Next, I'll be talking about some baseline changes that I would make. First off would be that Shadow Fiend actually does shadow damage. I know, like if you don't play Shadow Priest and you look at it, you're like, well, how does Shadow Fiend not do shadow? That doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't. It does no shadow damage whatsoever. It does physical damage. The reason I would like it to do shadow damage is so that it would scale with all the percentage damage increases that we have already built into the Shadow Tree. Because it makes no sense that my Shadow Fiend does the same amount of damage as a healer's Shadow Fiend would do when I'm spec'd into the Shadow Tree. It just doesn't make any sense. And then second, as I've already mentioned, Mind Flay should just be baseline. You'd get it at level 20 when you would normally get it anyway. This doesn't change anything, it's just there because I needed to free up the spot for improved Mind Flay in the talent tree. Alright, so onto the coefficients, and basically the Mind Flay coefficient should be at 70%. Instead of 57%, and that's just the baseline without being talented into the improved Mind Flay that I mentioned. So the reason I want to make it 70% is because it's only like a 13% increase, but as said before with the talent, it will be improved as you get more crit. So for those of you who are wondering, by the end of phase 2, you will typically have about 17 to 20% critical strike usually. So that would change the ratio from 70% to about 90%, which is still pretty good. It's not quite as good as the other 3-second cast time spells, but we also have really good coefficients on our dots, so that kind of makes up for it. The dots are going to stay the same. I mean, it doesn't really make much sense for me to up them. They're still fine at their 100 and 110% coefficients. It doesn't make much sense to change them. Mind Blast and Shadow Word Death should be at 50%. I don't know why they're at 42%. I mean, like, I feel like a spell that we have to sit down and cast and a spell that also can literally kill us should do a bit more damage than just an instant cast spell. But, you know, it's not a big increase. It's only like, what, 7%, so it's not giant. As for gear, I mean, all of the above changes pretty much fix gear perfectly. Mind Flay being able to scale with Critical Strike no longer makes it a dead stat for us. Even without a crit multiplier, I think it's totally fine. It raises the value of spell power, as we can see, because the coefficient is also going to increase. Haste, to be fair, stays about the same in value, but I think giving our dots haste scaling or making any changes along those lines would be a bit too much, seeing as no other class really has anything like that. And Mind Flay being a channel dot is still going to scale well with haste. It's just going to be a lot better of a spell because of the coefficient increase. So I think it's totally fine where it is. And that pretty much covers everything I've got on how to fix the Shadow Priest in TBC. Keep in mind, again, these changes are not to the overall class like design. It doesn't mean to impact the mana battery portion. I just don't think that us being one of the lowest DPS in the game right now on average is good, even despite our support that we give to the party. I could definitely see an argument being made that if we had competitive damage, we'd just be way too overpowered because of that mana battery portion. But I feel like that could just easily be toned down as our damage goes up, seeing as it is just a percentage of our shadow damage that we give back to the party. I don't know, it feels like it could easily be tuned, so I'm not really going to touch on that as much. I just really wanted to focus on how to make us a competitive DPS. So let me know what you think. If you liked the ideas, if you thought we'd be way too overpowered, if you think we'd fit right in with the other classes at the top, or is it just still not enough to make us a good class or a good DPS class? What ideas do you have that would make it better while still keeping the classic TBC Shadow like playstyle intact? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see y'all next time.